So if God infallibly foreknows what you will choose to do in any given situation, can you actually do anything different? Can you choose other than what God foreknows you will choose to do? Thus, do you really have freedom if His foreknowledge is infallible? Always a popular question, but particularly we're asking also, the crucifixion of Christ, which was foreordained, and as it says in Acts chapter 4, Herod and Pilate and them did exactly what God predestined for them to do. So, the reason this is relevant is because recently there was a video put out by some non-Calvinists. I haven't watched it, don't know much about what was in it, but they said something that a lot of Calvinists I see find inappropriate and going too far. But the question I had asked was, well, if you're a Calvinist and you believe that every single thing, event, choice, thought, and motive, is unchangeably decreed by God, then isn't it the case that these people said exactly what God determined for them to do, and this was His pleasure for them to do it? Then aren't you upset over what God wanted them to do? And then I ended my question by saying this is the perplexity of Calvinism, and it really is. The foreknowledge question came up in this discussion, but also I was asked, AK, don't you face the same problem? For example, with the crucifixion of Christ. Was it not objectively evil what they did to Christ? They murdered Christ. Was that not wrong? And yet it says that God predestined for this to happen. And also Joseph's brothers who sold him into slavery. In Genesis 50 and I think it's 20, Joseph says, in the end, if you know the story anyway, he says, you, my brothers, meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. And so here is an example where God meant something that these brothers of Joseph meant for evil. And they say, well, okay, don't you have the same problem? Well, no, I don't. But let's address the first one first. And this came up in my Calvinism debate in Jonesboro with Jeremiah Nortier. The problem is people are conflating two distinct things. You see, what a person will do, what a person will choose to do. Now, the key word is will. What they will to do, we're talking about volition, is not the same thing as what a person can do. When you use the word can, you're talking about a person's ability. The problem is when people are asking about God knowing what a person will do, so often is the case, more than not, in my experience, they start changing unknowingly and sincerely enough to can. They pose the question something along these lines. They'll say, well, if God knows what you will choose to do, then can you do differently? But you see, that's problematic because you're switching different concepts. Can and will are not the same thing. And if you start changing in your question or your premises, then you're going to get faulty conclusions. You see, logically, we can only say this, and I'm talking as a matter of logic, not necessarily theological. If we say that God knows what you will do, then the only logical conclusion is that you will not do otherwise. You understand? If God's foreknowledge is infallible, and He knows that you will choose to eat the apple and not the orange, then it is certain that you will eat the apple and not the orange. But it's not necessary. Necessary means there's no other possibility. But that's not the way foreknowledge works. And I'll demonstrate this by this one statement. God foreknows, one, that Bob will eat the apple and not the orange. And two, Bob could have eaten the orange and not the apple. You see, there's nothing logically flawed with that statement. But God foreknows not only what you will choose, but what you could have otherwise chosen. Not only is that logically the case, but it is also theologically true that a person can choose other than what they choose. Here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13 to the Christians at Corinth who had some temptations with idolatry. He said, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide a way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." Now notice that the word able is right there in the text. You will be able, you will have the ability to endure the temptation. So guess what? We know if we believe God's word, that if a person succumbs to temptation and sins, they were able to do otherwise. It says it right there in the text. They had a way of escape. They were able to endure it. If you sin, you were able to not have sinned. And so we know theologically that God foreknowing what a person will do does not mean that that person could not have done otherwise. It just means that they will not do otherwise, but not that they could not. Okay, but let's move to the next thing. People ask me, well, AK, don't you have the same problem as what you're asking the Calvinists? Because you believe, for example, that Christ's crucifixion was an evil act and yet God predestined it. Don't you believe when God says in the Scriptures in Genesis 50, when Joseph says to his brothers, you meant it as evil, but God meant it as good? Don't you have the same problem? Well, no, I do not. Calvinism says, and here's the problem, that not only does He work His will through that which is evil, but He also determines the evil, which is like a fire company setting fire to an apartment complex so that they can then go and put out the fire and save the people. But no, this is very different. I don't have the same problem. Okay, for example, Genesis chapter 50, when Joseph says to his brothers, you meant it as evil, but God meant it as good. Well, that's a passage for non-Calvinism. You see, that actually makes sense in the non-Calvinist perspective, not the Calvinist perspective. I hear Calvinists bring up examples like these two things that I'm talking about. All the while I'm thinking, you're missing the whole theological and logical elephant sitting right there in the room. First of all, it's irrational if He determined their evil, the brothers' evil and their wicked intentions, to then be mad at them or to judge them for what He determined for them to do. But the text doesn't say that. It just says He meant it for good while they meant it for evil. Now that's actually non-Calvinistic. In Calvinism, God determined both intentions, so it's an irrelevant distinction. Let me say it to you again. It is an irrelevant distinction if Calvinism is true, because the intention that the brothers had, distinguished from the intention that God had, all amounts to this one fact, that God determined both intentions in the first place. So it doesn't work, you see. But when you understand that the brothers were free, but they were evil, and nobody made them evil, and God did not predetermine them unchangeably to be evil, and He did not determine their evil thoughts or motives, then when they want to carry out evil acts, such as what they do to Joseph, God, all the while 1,000 steps ahead of them, is using it for something good. But that's non-Calvinism. The Bible doesn't say that He determined their intentions, their motives, or that they had to be evil. They didn't have to be jealous of Joseph in the first place. There's nothing in the Bible that says that. See, I believe God very well uses evil for His good purposes, but He does not determine for people to be evil in the first place. That is Calvinism, and that is their problem. Now, with the crucifixion, I don't have the problem the Calvinist does. Now, it is true, to answer some of the questions that were asked of me, that the murder of Christ was objectively true, objectively wrong. And yes, it says in Acts chapter 4 that God predetermined what Herod and Pilate would do. But the Bible does not say He predetermined that they would be evil, or that the motives of their heart would be evil. You see, God determined what way these evil people would be able to carry out their act. And God also knows how people will act in any given situation. For example, when Jesus is rebuking certain cities for rejecting His witness and His miracles in their city, He says, if Sodom had seen the miracles that were performed in you, they would have remained to this day. Sodom, along with Gomorrah, was destroyed by fire because of their wickedness of homosexuality. But He says, well, if they saw what you saw, they would remain, meaning they would have changed their mind. Now notice Jesus says they would have done this if the miracles had been done in their city. In other words, if such a thing had occurred, here's what they would have done. Jesus knows what the city of Sodom would have done had certain things occurred in it that did not in fact occur. So God knows how Herod and Pilate will act, and the Jewish leaders, in whatever situation He allows to take place. When they came to arrest Jesus, He did not have to permit them to arrest Him, but He did. And he knew that the Jews would hand him over to Pilate. And he knew that Pilate, being who he was, would give in to the political pressure. So yes, God is 1,000 steps ahead of these people. But the Bible never says He plans and determines their motives and intentions. He knows how to use evil for His good. The problem is, for Calvinists, He determines the evil in the first place, and that is the problem. So, for example, there are several times in the Gospels when it says people tried to kill Jesus, but His hour had not come. Or even arrest Him, and His hour was not yet. Meaning, God didn't allow them to do what they wanted to do. You see, they would have killed Christ at different times. Different people would have killed Him at different times in different ways had God allowed, but He didn't allow it. But when the opportunity came and God saw that it was the right time for Him to carry out His plan, He did allow them to carry out, knowing that they would hand Him over to Pilate and crucify Him. And this God is providing an atonement. If it had been up to them, and many, they would have killed Christ other ways. But God is 1,000 steps ahead. You see, here's the problem with Calvinism. They think that God has to determine the moves on both sides of the chessboard in order for Him to win. You see, I believe in a more, and I'm not trying to be derogatory here, but I believe in a more powerful and wiser God, who does not have to determine both sides of the chessboards in order to win. In fact, He can accomplish what He sets out to do from the beginning because He's that good. So no, to answer the question, I don't have the problem Calvinists do. And these passages like the crucifixion, and these passages like Genesis chapter 50 or Isaiah 10, some of you know what I'm talking about there. These are passages for my view. They are your problem, despite the fact that you so often cite them.